Picture the resolve it takes to track Soviet spies across Cold War Europe, then rise through the ranks of one of the world's premier law enforcement agencies, only to step onto a TEDx stage and turn those lessons into a talk that moves strangers to act. That constellation of careers belongs to Gina L Osborn. I'm Lisa Osborn, Gina's sister, and your guide for today's conversation. For 3 decades, Gina has served her country and community, proving that duty and daring are not mutually exclusive. She's a trailblazer, a master storyteller, and true to our family creed, a maverick. In this episode, you'll hear Gina's most gripping field stories, and more importantly, the frameworks she uses to turn adversity into advantage. Tools you can apply to elevate your own life and career. If you've ever been told to stay in your lane and instead felt the instinct to build a brand new highway, this episode is for you.
My name is Gina L Osborn, and I'm an Army veteran. I spent 6 years during the end of the Cold War as a counterintelligence agent. I was appointed as an FBI agent, and during my 22-year career, worked everything from Asian organized crime to terrorism. I became the assistant special agent in charge of cyber and computer forensics. And then I came out of retirement and spent 2 years as the safety and security officer at LA Metro. Now I'm here to help you make your Maverick move.
Welcome, Gina, to your own show.
Thank you, sister. Out of all of the people that could have interviewed me for my own show, I wanted you to do it.
Well, good, because I know all your secrets, and we'll share some of them today. How about that?
I hope not.
Well, let's get started. So just to help our audience who may not have met you before get to know you faster, how would you introduce yourself in 30 seconds or less to someone that you've just met?
30 seconds or less. So I am a retired FBI executive. I am an Army veteran. I was the Chief Safety and Security Officer for LA Metro. And I love my family, and I am a creative person. So I guess that's all about me in 30 seconds.
And you're a great sister, so I love you.
I love you.
Then your latest podcast is called Making Maverick Moves. It's a theme of your TED Talk, too, and we recently got to go up and do that when you did that together. We're going to talk more about that coming up in the episode. But most people know Maverick from Top Gun, the character in Top Gun. But how do you describe a maverick? What's a maverick?
Well, as I said in my TED Talk, a maverick is an unorthodox or independent-minded person, someone who doesn't go along with the program. And the problem is that our world isn't set up for mavericks. So really what I like to think is if you're going to make that maverick move, so a maverick move can be something small to get to the point where you're ready to make the big one. But really that maverick move is identifying that hill you're willing to die on, because you've got that conviction and you've got that drive, and it's a no turning back situation.
And we're going to be talking more about that, and you're going to share some of your best tips coming up. But what was the first, thinking back to little Gina, what was the first maverick move you ever made?
When I was 16 years old, I bought my first car. It was a 1970 Renault, French-made. I remember it had sliding glass windows in the back.
The slider doors in the back seat.
Exactly.
Slider windows.
Yes, and I love the show MASH because I have always wanted to be a writer. I used to write TV shows, and I wrote a movie when I was in high school, and I loved the show MASH, and I loved Alan Alda because he was a writer and a director and a producer. And so I went to the flower shop and I bought some flowers, and I drove up to, I believe it was 20th Century Fox back in the day. Told the gate guard I had flowers for Alan Alda. They let me on the set, and I gave him the flowers, and he gave me a whole bunch of tips on how I could get into the writing game.
Wow. How much did that inspire you? Like, did it keep you going? Did it get you to write your first screenplay?
He was so gracious to have what today would be considered a stalker, because I didn't just do it once. I didn't just do it twice. I may have done it at least 3 times, but every time I went up to speak with him, he was very, very kind to me. And he did it all, and he was willing to give me tips on how I could break into the business.
Oh, that's awesome. And you were just a teenager then, but our first job started when we were much younger, pre-teenager, when we worked in the blazing sun in Arizona.
Oh, yes.
In our dad's junkyard.
Exactly.
We did piecework.
We did, and we had a choice between either being in the air-conditioned trailer or stacking bricks for a penny a brick in the blazing sun in the summer in Arizona. And we always picked the stacking bricks.
Because the answering the phone in the air-conditioned office only paid $5 a day, and we could make more stacking bricks, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Plus, he wanted us to type things out before they had corrector tape. And he wanted it to be perfect, so we would type the same letter out at least 1,000 times.
Because you learned your typing skills right there.
Exactly.
And then, so when you were a teenager or so, you worked in a comedy club. What did you do?
So I was a cocktail waitress in a comedy club. In addition to wanting to be a writer, I also wanted to be this international woman of intrigue. Somehow I got into reading about the CIA, and I came across a book, I think it was called The Spy Who Wore Red, and it was about a woman who was a spy in World War II. And so it was just something that if I could chase spies across Europe, that's what I wanted to do. So I was in my second year of college, and I was out of money. Didn't know how I was going to go to a 4U university to get into the CIA. And I was in the library, and a young man sat next to me and started telling me about the Army's counterintelligence program. So the next day I went down to the Army recruiter. I remember I was wearing a black and white polka dotted dress and a fuchsia hat because it was the 80s. And they looked at me like I was nuts. And I enlisted, and 8 months later I was eating dirt at Fort Jackson, South Carolina.
That was amazing. And you shocked our whole family with that one because you were like, you're joining the Army. And we didn't know you wanted to join the Army or had any interest in a military career.
I know. I knew I was on the delayed entry program for at least 8 months. And I think I told my family a week before I left.
That was a shocker.
I didn't want anyone to talk me out of it.
No. And I just have to comment that the hat and the fuchsia was a throwback to your Barbizon modeling school days of being a teenager, right?
Yes.
You always knew how to glam yourself up.
I am a Barbizon School of Modeling graduate circa 1979.
Ooh, you're giving your age now. Okay.
Before Kyler was born.
6 years, 6 years in the Army. Mm-hmm. What did you do there? You really did. You really got to chase spies in the Army?
I was a counterintelligence agent. And so my first 2.5 years, I was at SHAPE, which is ironically where Private Benjamin was assigned in Belgium at SHAPE headquarters. I was at a little air base called Chev's Air Base, and I did, what did I do? I did a lot of personnel investigations and did a lot of presentations, and then they came to me and wanted me to attend this surveillance course, and because they were creating this new team that was going to support all of the high-profile espionage investigations in the European theater for the Army. And so I went through that school and wound up moving to Frankfurt, Germany. And for the next 3.5 years, I was probably on the road for 10 months out of the year chasing spies across Europe. It was amazing to go from a cocktail waitress at a comedy club to, chasing spies across Europe. It was truly a dream come true. Wow.
And you spent a lot of time in the car, and you had different outfits, right? Different disguises? Is that
yeah.
Right?
In fact, the CIA, they programmed us for our disguises, and they gave us a disguise kit. And one of the best thing that I have, and I think I still have it, was my pregnancy pillow because that came in handy when you're sitting in a car for about 72 hours at a time and you wanted to take a nap in the back seat. But yeah, so they had that, materials to put scars on my face and wigs and all of that stuff.
They trained you to do that? Mm-hmm. That's amazing. Wait, did you get like your own actual customized?
Oh yeah,
kits?
Yeah.
Like you look like this, so we're giving you these outfits.
Yeah,
that's amazing. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's amazing. So you were in Europe, and so you did 6 years in the Army and came back. And did you know you wanted to join the FBI, or were you trying for the FBI, the CIA? But what was going on? There was a hiring freeze, right?
So I had planned to go into the CIA. That was my dream. And while I was in the Army, I got my degree. Went out, interviewed with the CIA. They took me to a hotel room in an undisclosed location to interview me. And for whatever reason, I didn't get in. And that was a shock because my entire process leading up to that point was to get into the CIA, going into the Army, getting my degree, doing all of that. So it was shocking. So I decided, okay, I'm going to have to get over this somehow. And I put in for the FBI, and they took me, and I started in April of 1996.
And when did you get out of the Army?
I got out of the Army in 92, so I sat through a 4-year hiring freeze. Yeah.
Did you go back to the comedy club?
No. I actually worked at a vitamin company. Yes, I was Mr. Patrick's.
Selling vitamins?
I was what was I? I was the director of distributor sales for a vitamin company, and I did such a good job. The 92-year-old CEO pulled me in to be his personal assistant. So I did that. And I remember when the FBI called for my security clearance to interview him. Oh, no. He was his own person. And so I was a little nervous. So I put the call into him. And about 20 seconds later, he came out of his office. And I'm like, well, what happened? And he said, I told them that you would be making more of a difference here, so you don't want to work for the FBI. And I'm like, oh, boy. So luckily, they did not listen to him, and I wound up getting in.
Well, who else were you worried about them interviewing for your background check? Family members?
Yeah, that could be it. Yeah, I think I was pretty, maybe not. Never mind. I'm not going to tell any secrets here. You're not going to get me to tell any secrets, sister.
Okay, but Quantico. I actually went out to Quantico to visit you once, but I don't think that was when you were going through the original training at Quantico. What is that like? All FBI agents go to Quantico to train, is that right? When
Correct.
They're new? Yeah.
Yes. When I went through, I think it was 15 and a half weeks, and I think it's maybe 20 weeks now. And it's, having gone through basic training in the Army, it was sort of a gentleman or gentle person's academy, but they do make you do a lot of things. There was a lot of, the interesting thing is, when you're going through basic training, I was 20, 21 years old, and then going through the FBI Academy, the average age is 31 years old. So your bones don't bend as easy as they did. So it was a little bit more difficult to try and do all of the running and jumping and shooting and all of those other things. But it was a good experience.
So you got out of training, got your first case, and it was so great for us as a family that you got to come back to your hometown to actually launch your FBI career. Do you want to talk? I know your TED Talk, it tells an amazing story about your first case in the FBI, so make sure you're watching for that. But talk about the first case and what it was like to just be a brand new FBI agent and what you worked on.
Yeah, I was really fortunate. All three of my roommates went to New York, and I got to come home to L.A., and I got the added bonus of getting the Santa Ana RA. So my very first arrest was across the street from my high school. So that was interesting. It was good to be home. And my first case was Thai girls trafficked into the United States and forced into prostitution. And all of the suspects were in Little Saigon. And my TED Talk will go into that whole story, but I wound up linking up with the Westminster Police Department. I had no idea that their chief hated the FBI. And not only did he not want FBI agents in his city, he did not want them in his department. And one day I decided I don't think they had phones back then because I don't remember why it was that I didn't call ahead, but I just entered into their lobby and announced Gina Osborn, FBI, and caused all sorts of commotion. A detective, Tommy Ratcliffe, he brought me back to his office, gave me a few names, and sent me out the back door. And then I'm like, wow, this is great. I ran the names. They were linked to international organized crime. And I went back and wound up going directly into the chief's conference room. And it turned out okay. I wound up for the next 5 years working Asian organized crime with Tommy in the basement of the Westminster Police Department.
That's great, and what a career to launch that, and that's because that's great. So back in the 90s, if you went out, like someone called the FBI and you showed up, what did people think? I mean, it was still pretty male-dominated back then.
Oh, sure. When I went into the Army, I'm thinking the numbers were fewer than 10% of the soldiers were women. And then I expected 10 years later that it was going to be better for the FBI, and I think it was up at 14% of all of the agents. And when I left in 2018, it had only gone up to 20% of the agents being women. But yeah, people did not expect to see me, but that helped me. I think it helped me as much as it hurt me. I remember one time I was working a loan sharking case. It was Benny the loan shark and David the executor, and they were planning to murder somebody, and I knew about it, and so we brought them both in after arresting them, and David the executor decided to confess everything to me. And then he's like, okay, can I go home? And it's like, no, I think we're going to keep you for a little while. And then we went to court. It was a Friday that we arrested him. Went to court on Monday. He read the affidavit that I wrote. And as I was escorting him back to the marshals, he couldn't believe that I had told on him. So I thought that was that was very helpful. It didn't happen all the time, but if it happens once, I was in a good place with it.
You dazzled him.
I must
He forgot you were an FBI agent.
Exactly.
But did you ever feel like you are a glam girl? You put a lot of, work into how you look, and you're beautiful.
Thank you.
But did you ever feel like you needed to dress it down a little bit on the job?
I think I had that perfectionism that all young women do, going in, especially being in a male-dominated field. I remember changing clothes about 15 times before I would go out on a search warrant because I didn't want to draw attention on myself. However, I did want to be who I was. And I got a lot of flack in the Army because I would go full glam in my battle dress uniform. And I remember the first sergeant when I was at Fort Huachuca at the training school. He used to track me down because I would wear red lipstick with my battle dress uniform. And whenever he would catch me, he'd make me do push-ups. So yes, I do remember that. But it's all about being who you are.
Yeah, well, good. And authentic is working for you. That's for sure. That's for sure. You're sharing it in your podcast. You're sharing it in this interview and in your TED Talk, which is, I can't wait till it comes out. It might be out by the time you're watching this episode. So look for it on the TEDx site because you did a really great job with that. We're going to talk about what it's like to do a TEDx talk a little bit later in our conversation. But you mentioned that you worked in Little Saigon for at least 5 years, your first 5 years. Where did you go after that in the FBI? Because you wound up being in the FBI for over 20 years.
22 years. Yeah, so 9/11 happened. And so for 9/11, everything changed. Right before 9/11, the criminal program was king, and that was the number one priority. And then 9/11 happened, and then terrorism and counterintelligence became the priority. So I wound up being the counterintelligence program coordinator for the FBI Los Angeles, and then I wound up being the supervisor of an extraterritorial squad. So anytime there was a terrorist attack against U.S. persons or U.S. interests in Southeast Asia, India, or Australia, my team would go out and investigate that. And so I spent some time in Indonesia, in the Philippines, Australia, and that was a really fascinating assignment, especially, in the 2003, 2004 timeframe.
And then for a while you went around the country inspecting FBI offices. What does an FBI inspection entail?
Yeah, so in order for us to promote into the executive ranks in the FBI, we have to do our headquarters time. And so I went back to headquarters and I was on the FBI's inspection staff. So every 3 years, a field office or a headquarters entity would be inspected to make sure that they're effective and efficient in the way they're running their programs and their cases and things. And so I went out every 2 weeks. I was in headquarters, and every 2 weeks I was anywhere USA inspecting field offices. And that definitely came to help me later on in the line, especially in my job at Metro, looking at the contracts, the law enforcement contracts, to make sure that people were doing what they were supposed to be doing.
Interesting. You bring up LA Metro. You were chief safety officer there, the top cop. There wasn't a police chief there, at the time. It was you. So we're going to be talking about that coming up in this episode. I want to know more because especially going from the FBI to LA, policing LA Metro, one of the largest transit agencies in the world. But let's go in the FBI, just to stay linear here. you went on to, after you did the inspections, got to come back to Orange County, got to come home again, and then you wound up doing cyber stuff. But at what point you also investigated some really high-profile cases, including the terror attack in San Bernardino. Was that while you were doing cyber, or how did that come into play?
So I wound up, while I was on inspection, the cyber program for the FBI was brand new, and none of the team leaders had any sort of technical skill. And because I had been married to a cyber guy, I kind of knew I wasn't afraid of it.
And you are not a techie.
I am by far. I am the one who cannot understand why my computer screen is black, and then only to find out that the computer is not turned on.
It's probably not charged. You're pretty good at not having your phone charged.
Yeah, that is a fact too. So I wound up, I did one big inspection in Chicago and then continued inspecting cyber programs. And so when they created an assistant special agent in charge position in LA for cyber and computer forensics, I put in for it. And really that was where I learned what authentic leadership was all about, because I came in as a lead from the front leader because that's what I learned from my male mentors, not only in the Army, but, going into the FBI as well. But when I was leading from the front with my cyber people, I would turn around and no one would be following me because the technical skill is what they respected, and that's what you needed to have as a leader in the cyber world. So that's when I really had to look at what my superpowers were, because, I thought I'm really good at communication. I'm good at problem solving. I just came from headquarters, so I know where all the money trees are. And when you buy equipment for cyber people, they absolutely love you. And so really I just looked to who I was, and I couldn't lead from the front, so I had to turn into a servant leader. And it was my job to get my people everything they needed to do their jobs. And that's really how I became an authentic leader and settled in with my leadership because I had to, because I couldn't lead from the front if I didn't have the skills. And it was interesting because my young cyber supervisors who worked with me, I would I would help them if they had a personnel issue. I would help them in different areas that they didn't have the expertise. So we really became a tight team because we were able to complement each other.
Oh, that's awesome, because you weren't competing with them because you didn't do what they did, but you could support them and get them what they want. And I'll bet there was at least a Maverick Move or two that came along this time. What would you say your biggest Maverick Move was? And you spoke earlier about what a Maverick Move is.
Yeah. So I think I was responsible for the Sony investigation when North Korea had hacked Sony Pictures Entertainment.
Because they didn't like a movie that Sony put out.
Correct. Yeah, there was a movie called The Interview, and it depicted the supreme leader of North Korea. I don't want to tell everybody what happens at the end in case they want to go see that movie, but I'm just saying it wasn't a pretty depiction of their supreme leader, and they were not happy with that. And so they wound up taking out Sony Pictures network completely. I mean, they brought them to their knees. But the security team over at Sony, we worked very hard with them. I had a young supervisor who ran that entire case beautifully. In fact, he did such a good job, FBI headquarters, whenever they had a model, that was the model going forward, the Sony model, for any massive catastrophic breach, that they would do the Sony model after what this young supervisor went out and did with this case. So Maverick Moves. I started for computer forensics lab.
That's what I was thinking, though.
Oh yeah, here in Orange County. So I was really proud about that.
And that was a multi-agency, right? The different agencies, law enforcement from different agencies worked there, and it's still in Orange County, in the city of Orange.
Yeah, and I'm a big believer in task forces. I mean, even teams. Even when I was on the surveillance team and that investigative team in the Army, just surrounding myself with great people. And so I'm a big believer in, different agencies bring different things to the table. And I was very, very surprised when we stood up the Orange County Regional Computer Forensics Lab that LAPD came on board. And, they had their officers, LAPD officers were in Orange County doing computer forensics. So that really meant a lot that the community really came together because it was something that was really needed at the time. At the time, police agencies would go and seize a computer and they had no way to get into it because they didn't have that expertise. So we really added that skill set and tool set for them to come to the lab and do those cases.
And it was one of the first of its kind, right? There was maybe one or two others in the country?
I forget how many. There were probably there were at least 10 around the country,
Okay.
but the fact that there was 2 already in California, there was one up in San Francisco and one down in San Diego. So the fact that we beat out field offices across the country was pretty amazing. And the reason why is because we had so many chiefs and the sheriff here in Orange County come together and work to make this happen.
Awesome. You've shared so many stories and experiences today, Gina. Is there something extraordinary that you witnessed while you were in the FBI? Maybe a lesser known story that you haven't shared before, or anything standing out that you want to leave us with on this chapter of your life?
I will say that when I look back on my career with the FBI, what is my legacy? And I think back, worked a lot of really interesting cases. However, when I think about my legacy, I think about the supervisors who I was responsible for, the agents, and I really liked to stretch my young supervisors coming up behind me to make sure that they were becoming better and better leaders. So every now and again, they'll reach out to me and tell me how they've gotten a legal attaché job or they got promoted into my old position. And really, that's what legacy is all about, is giving your time and mentoring people in such a way that, they're going to continue your message to the people that come after them. So I would say, looking back, that's probably the biggest legacy. It wasn't a case, it was the people.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. We're going to get into, so you retired from the FBI. You went you've always wanted to be a screenwriter. You've always written. You're a chronic journaler. When you retired from the FBI, you put some effort into writing and pitching shows. And so what do you like about storytelling? And what have you been doing, in your most recent phase pre-LA Metro?
So I love telling stories. One thing at the FBI Academy they teach you is how to build rapport with people. Because really, when you come into contact with an FBI agent, either you're a victim of a crime or you're being arrested for a crime, or it's kind of like you're in the most vulnerable state when you come across an FBI agent. Or you could be a witness, and that's another category. But in order for us to do our jobs, we had to build that rapport to get you to trust me so that you would be willing to work with me, you would be willing to give me information so we could work together and I could go out and do my job. And it's all about storytelling. They teach you, tell stories, find what you have in common with the people. But that's something that I've always loved, is creating stories, telling stories, sharing stories. And so after I got out of the FBI, I was very, very fortunate to meet some people like Jonathan Mastow, who directed Arnold Schwarzenegger in the Terminator 3 movie. He and I were writing partners for a while, so I learned a lot on how to tell a story, and that really helped me, especially with my TED Talk, to be able to take a story and really tell it in a way that's going to inspire people. So that's something that has always been interesting to me.
And I could tell from your TED Talk that you learned a lot about storytelling. Your TED Talk's a very compelling story. So what interests you most now from the writing aspect? Because you have so many real life experiences that your first podcast was a true crime podcast, right?
Yeah.
And that got quite popular because that's a super, popular genre. A lot of people are interested in true crime. But what interests you now in writing or putting a show together? What would you like to do?
Well, I think right now I'm doing a lot of thought leadership, especially when it comes to helping people make their Maverick move, helping people get to the point, because really when you think about it, everybody wants to make a Maverick move. You know, everybody wants to have success or grab onto that brass ring, but there's always something that stops us from actually getting there. And so with this podcast, just being able to bring people in to tell stories about how they were able to make that move. And sometimes, like with Metro, I did not expect to make a Maverick move at Metro. And that's kind of where it all came into perspective, because I would always counsel the young people coming behind me is you need to pick the hill you're willing to die on. Is this the hill you're willing to die on? You may be really, really mad at something and you want to do something, but there is consequences that come with choosing a hill that you're willing to die on. But sometimes that hill chooses you. And that's what happened with me at Metro, that I got wrapped up in these law enforcement contracts. The Metro contracted with LAPD, LASD, and Long Beach PD, and I identified performance deficiencies. And why it was such a issue for me is because I would go out and talk to the bus operators and the mechanics and the custodians, and they would look at me as the person who was going to help them be safe at work. I mean, imagine going to a place of work where you don't feel safe, and there's shootings and there's stabbings all around you. And so my heart was in it. In fact, I would say it was as much or more of a calling for me than the FBI was, because so many people were relying on me to be able to get from point A to point B so they could go get their groceries, so workers can come and have a safe place, a safe, clean place to work. And so when I identified that these law enforcement agencies weren't doing what they were supposed to be doing, it wound up coming to that place where you either have to move forward or retreat. And it was all about the downtown Santa Monica station where the sheriffs were supposed to be. And they were supposed to be doing their job, and they weren't there on March 15th. And then later that day, I find out that they're at a golf tournament. And a week later, I get an email with them telling me that, oh, no, we were having specialty interviews that day, which I didn't think sounded right. And
they have a big golf tournament?
Yeah, the same day. So how are they supposed to be policing Metro, doing specialty interviews, and
playing golf?
Playing golf, exactly. So I went to the Inspector General and told her about it. She told me that she was going to initiate a full investigation. I had told the CEO, I texted her, and I said, out of the interest of collaboration, I went to the Inspector General to tell her about this, and then 3 days later, I was fired.
That's tough. After your long career in the FBI, had you been fired before?
I had never been fired before.
So that's really traumatic the first time it happened.
It was a big deal.
Yeah.
And, but the funny thing is I learned that every crisis comes an opportunity. And so I remember I went home in the Uber because they put me into an Uber and sent me home, which was supposed to be a dignified way of doing things.
Well, wait a second. No, they didn't really. In fact, we should actually back up a little bit. And we'll come back to this part in the story, because we didn't say after you wrapped up your FBI career, then you were retired for a few years, and then the opportunity at LA Metro came along, one of the largest transit agencies in the world. So you were talking about, you felt that you needed to protect the drivers and the passengers on the trains and buses in Los Angeles coming out of the pandemic. So no one was really riding those transit vehicles over the pandemic, except for people who had nowhere else to go, who were experiencing homelessness. So you came in to clean it up, and you did clean it up. So how long were you there total?
So I was there for 2 years, and I remember I asked my team, because I'm a big believer, as a leader, you need to go out and see what it is you're leading. So we went to 7th and Metro at 4 o'clock in the morning when the gates went up, and they were having problems because homeless encampments were encamped living outside of the gates. And so as soon as this happened every morning, the gates would go up, all of the unhoused would come into the station, they would pop the emergency gate the emergency exit gate, everybody would walk on through, and I remember watching 2 LAPD officers just standing there as methamphetamine or fentanyl was wafting up onto, the upstairs, and they weren't doing anything. And it was shocking to me because there was no order whatsoever. During the pandemic, they didn't do fare enforcement, they didn't do code of conduct enforcement, so it was Mad Max beyond the Thunderdome. That was what it was: stabbings, shootings. I had never encountered that much violence in the first 2 weeks that I was at LA Metro than I did in my entire 28-year law enforcement career.
Different culture, huh?
Definitely a different culture. But I went into it. I went on ride-alongs with operators, train operators, went out, spoke to the custodians, and everyone was mad. I mean, people were angry, and they were angry at me because, they're unsafe. They felt unsafe, and it was my job. So it took me a while, a year to earn the trust because they could see that I was trying to do what, keep them safe. Worked a lot with the unions so that they understood exactly what it was that we were trying to do. Built a magnificent team that it is amazing. We decreased crime in 2023 by 35%. So we were very, very successful. And then, and then this happened.
And then we were, where we kind of reframed. You were at the point where the day you called them on being at the golf tournament.
Right.
Allegedly, they were at that golf tournament, and then you called the inspector general and told them what you discovered. Mm-hmm. And this was the LA sheriffs. There's LAPD, LA sheriffs, and Long Beach police. So you're talking about three big, taking on the big boys in those three huge agencies in Southern California. And then to be let go, but not to be let go like in any kind of way where there was any kind of dignity about it, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, how did you feel? Let's talk about that morning. You just went to work like it was a Monday or a Tuesday, just like any other Monday or Tuesday, right?
Yeah.
Did you have any sense of intuition that something was going to happen?
No, it was interesting because I was trying to get Metro their own police department. I had spent the last 2 years trying to get them their own police department. And all of these deficiencies that I found with the law enforcement agencies, I was sending to the CEO. So she was aware, here are all the deficiencies. And I was hoping that we were going to use this information to be able to get the board to agree that Metro needed their own police department. So it was a normal Tuesday, 10 o'clock in the morning. I was mentoring a Metro employee who had reached out to me on LinkedIn, waiting for them to come in. And they were there, so I get up to greet them, and instead the chief people officer and the employee advocate walked into my office, sat down. I had never met the employee advocate in person, so I was excited to see her. I'm giving her a hug. It's like, oh, it's so great to see you guys. And then they sit down, and the chief people officer had a piece of paper, put it in front of me, and said, today's your last day at Metro. You're being terminated. And, I just clicked into, that police mode where it's like, okay, here's my badge, here's my, and they're like, well, we'll pack everything up and we're going to, we want this to be dignified, they said. And then they walked me past my staff, and which to me was heartbreaking because, because they're just as shocked as I was. They wouldn't let me take my Metro car home, of course. They wouldn't let anyone drive me home. So they stuffed me in an Uber, not even an Uber XL. It was like an itty-bitty tiny little Uber.
With your knees on the back of the seat.
Exactly. And so I was quiet all the way home.
40 minutes or so, right?
Yeah. And then I just sat for 2 days thinking, okay, now what? There has to be a purpose for this. I mean, I knew that there had to be something because I wasn't done. I mean, I wanted to finish my work of helping Metro get their own police department. So 2 days later, there was a board meeting going on, and I was notified that Rachel Uranga from the LA Times had heard that I was no longer with Metro, and she wanted to talk to me about it. And then I get a phone call from Rachel Uranga on my personal phone that I didn't answer. And then I'm like, I got to get an attorney because it's out that I was terminated from Metro. So the next day there was a newspaper article on it, and that kind of made me realize, what the opportunity was. I was able to continue my work by making everything that I had discovered public so that the board would actually hear it, because the CEO wanted everything filtered through her to the board. So this was my opportunity to make the world understand that Metro needs to have safety and security on their system. And although the CEO talked about it being her number one priority, she wasn't putting her money where her mouth was. So based after that, I think the board gave the security team over $68 million or something for technology, something that I had requested, maybe 6 months before. They got fortified turnstiles, and then in June of that year, I went to the board meeting. You were there with me, and I spoke in public comment to support Metro getting their own police department, and the board voted unanimously for Metro to get their own police department. So that was my purpose for all of that.
Yeah, that's amazing. So you got to see that happen. It just wasn't exactly in the way that you had envisioned it originally, right?
Yeah, and I think that's the lesson, is that you can have your dream, but just know that there is not a direct point from point A to point B to get there. And I think I accomplished more after I was fired than I did the 2 years before I was fired, because I was able to use my voice and make it known what the truth was.
So would you like to still be at Metro? They're gearing up for the Olympics coming up in just a few years, and crime was starting to go down under your watch on the Metro. Do you miss it?
I miss my team. Right after I got fired, I had a lot of bus operators and custodians and rail operators and people reach out to me, which was really heartwarming. To know that they were not happy with the fact that I wasn't there anymore. So I would say stay tuned. I am in litigation, and we'll see what happens.
Well, and it was such a big job, though. I mean, it was your life. I mean, you would be calling the police in the middle of the night when you would get a report, of some poor elderly woman was on the Metro and tried to report, being harassed or abused or a crime that happened to her, and then sometimes it would not always be followed up on in a prompt way. So you were on it 24/7. It seemed like calling up to make sure that people were accountable. For the law enforcement was accountable for what you were paying them for. So,
yeah. Well, I fell in love. I remember one time I did a ride along on a bus with my transit security officers, and whenever I would get on a bus, I would introduce myself to the bus operator. And so I gave the bus operator my card, and I went back to the back of the bus, and then a couple minutes later I hear, "Gina!" And I'm like, okay. And so I run up, yes, what can I do for you? How can I help you? And she wanted to know, what are you doing to make me safe, to keep me safe? And so I love that interaction. I love bus operators. I've already talked about bus operators on this podcast about what great leaders they are. So so it was very meaningful for me. It was a calling.
Well, good. I'm glad that happened, that they'll have their own police department, and hopefully things will be safer at LA Metro. So you must have been in shock for a couple of days when you were let go from Metro, and then how did you begin to rebuild and reimagine your next Maverick move?
Well, I became intimately familiar with what a Maverick Move was because I inadvertently apparently made one myself and suffered those consequences. And when I created this podcast or rebranded this podcast, and I was able to speak with Chief Kristen Crowley from the fire department, LA Fire. I spoke to her 2 months before the fires happened, and then to see what happened to her and I knew when I spoke to her in November of last year that I asked her, what is your Maverick Move? And she said, I'm making one right now because I don't have the resources to do my job. So then fast forward, the fires happen. A month later, we're getting ready to put her interview out, and 2 days before we launched her interview, she was fired. The mayor fired her. And so if I could tell those stories of people who have found a hill that they're willing to die on and inspire other people, that's what I want to do.
So you created the TED Talk about leadership and about being a maverick. So I want people to watch your TED Talk, so we don't want to give everything away. But you will share some Maverick moves or some things for people to think about, our viewers to think about. But let's just talk about the TED Talk a little bit, because I saw you go from when you first started working on your TED Talk, and it's evolved, because it took about 6 months, and that was pretty quick for you to actually get on the TEDx stage after 6 months. But it was a lot of writing your story, editing your story, honing your story until every word mattered. I mean, what did you talk about the experience of doing the TED Talk and what you learned from it?
Well, if I had a choice between going through Army basic training again or going through that TED Talk experience, I would have to think about it because it was, I always had a fear of public speaking. Surprisingly, when I was all throughout my law enforcement career, it wasn't until after I retired that I started to do speaking, because I would always get so nervous. You saw me speak before. I would always have the nerves in my breath, and I wouldn't be able to speak right. And so this kind of represented every single solitary fear that I had when it came to public speaking. And then you have to memorize the entire 12-minute script, and that was not easy for me.
I was so afraid for you. I was having so
gosh.
much stress when we went up to do your TED Talk, because I saw you 2 weeks before practicing your TED Talk, and it was not even close to memorized. So I'm like, maybe we could delay this TED Talk.
I knew you were trying to do that. I
cared for you. I didn't want to see you get up there and
I know, but I'm really good at, I had a very wonderful woman by the name of Kimberly Weil who helped me, and she was very, very good. And I got sick, and 2 weeks before.
That's why that was your perfect out.
I know. And you're like, you know what? You can
You're
call.
too sick.
You don't think? Yeah, you were kind of worried about it. And then the last week, I was doing these lightning rounds, practicing, rehearsing. And I hate to rehearse. I'm not a patient person, so doing the same thing over and over again, it's not my bag. And then I would do these lightning rounds with Kimberly on Zoom, and I had never once got through my entire TED Talk without blanking on something and forgetting the words. And so that day, it was Manteca's very first TEDx.
That was up near Stockton. So road trip for sister. We had a sister road trip to get there. That picked me up in Santa Barbara.
And took the shortcut through Santa Barbara up to Manteca. And there were just such wonderful people, the community that put this on. And I just, I rehearsed it in front of our good friend George, who came up. What a lovely man. He got to see me, and I still couldn't make it through the entire thing. But what was great is when I went on stage, I couldn't see anybody. I just had bright lights in my face. So I was sort of speaking into a vortex, but I could feel the people. And there was one part of my TED Talk that Kimberly would get me on, because I would ask a question, but I wouldn't give enough time to answer it for them, for people to think about it. And then when I asked the question, someone in the front row screamed, "Me!" or something like that. Yeah. So the energy really, really got me through. So I made it to Maverick Move number 3 before I choked a little bit, but I recovered and had a strong ending. But I think it was a great experience, because it really, made me understand that connection with the audience. I don't think I had that before, but now I do.
Yeah, so you need to look for Gina's TED Talk. It will be out probably by the time we get this conversation out. Would you encourage anyone else to do a TED Talk? What was a big thing that you learned? Or, it had to have instilled confidence, because when you actually did your TED Talk, it's like, wow, you were at a different level. The different level than I saw you at 2 weeks before, and a different level than when I saw you present before. So I really, sitting there watching you, and the audience was enthralled, and it was a really great community of people in Manteca who came together as a community to put this TEDx on, and we were glad to be part of it. But I don't want to lose my thought here, but what it really took you to a new level, and I could see you going out and doing more keynotes and speaking at conferences, which I know that's what you want to do on leadership. So I could see you taking your career to the next level as a presenter. But why would you suggest that someone else, go into doing a TED Talk and it just takes up their whole life?
Well, I would say it leads back to what my legacy in the FBI was in stretching my young supervisors, because this TED Talk stretched me in such an uncomfortable way that it made me better. It made me grow. So that is a great lesson for people to know that, if you're going to stay stagnant, if you're going to stay with status quo, you're not going to get to that point where you can make that maverick move, because you're not, growing, and you're not preparing yourself to be able to take that on. So I would say I highly recommend it. Just know that it is a giant process, from the application process to get selected to do it. And then once you're there, and it's a real deal. There's no backing out.
Yes, 4 cameras. It's a huge stage, because we got there in the morning because we drove up the day before. So we saw this conference room in the morning. It was like, not much. They're kind of putting up the little stage, and then we find out that, with the lights, well, she's not going to be able to see, the audience with the lights. And they really, in one day, put up that show, and it was amazing. So, it's a big production.
Yeah, and the camaraderie that I had with the speakers. We had a 16-year-old young lady give her TED Talk that was stellar, and so I made some new friends, and but I think stepping outside of your comfort zone, there's a lot to be said for that, because it definitely helps you grow.
We only have a couple minutes left, so give us something for our viewers to think about to make a maverick move, or how would they make a maverick move, or even kind of inspire them to want to make a maverick move? What is your best words of wisdom in our closing moments?
Gosh, I think what I learned in the last year, which was probably the hardest year, one of the hardest years of my life, having gone through that, loss of reputation for being terminated, just really get to know yourself. You can never underestimate really looking inside and reflecting on what's important to you and what you really want to do. Because if you would have told me a little over a year ago, before I got fired, that I would have this podcast and I would be doing TED Talks, and I'm going to be speaking at the Global Women in Tech Conference next month. I never would have thought that this would have been my journey, and I'm loving it. So sometimes we just have to, just sit back and let the universe take the wheel, and, because we're going to go where we're supposed to be, but it may not be the way that we think. And we have to kind of drop the reins and let that happen in order to have that beautiful, wonderful life that we've always wanted.
But a maverick move is a calculated risk. You were saying that you've got to be willing to die for it. So how do you kind of weigh the factors, whether you want to actually make that move when so much it rides on it?
Yeah, well, I think, you've got that big maverick move, the one that I made, and then you've got like the daily maverick moves. What are we tolerating? What do we tolerate? And how do we stop tolerating those things so we can get that energy back? Because when you tolerate something, it annoys you, it takes up space, it takes up energy. So really, I think just kind of narrowing that playing field and really understanding what it is that you want, and making those little a maverick move could be as easy as saying, hey, I want a few minutes a day to be able to drink my coffee. We had a listener named Megan who every time she poured a cup of coffee in the morning, she was running after the kids and doing this and that, and, she could never have a hot cup of coffee until she decided she was going to put the Spice Girls on, and for those 2 songs, she was going to drink her hot coffee and no one was allowed to bother her. That's her own maverick move. So if you make enough of those little maverick moves, you're going to be able to get to the place where you want to be.
Yeah. Cutting the clutter out sounds like, all those things that you think are so important, but maybe they're not that important. I mean, I guess that's what that said to me.
Yeah, you have to have your priorities. And if it's not on your priority list, then you shouldn't be spending time and effort on it. I just want to say that thank you for taking the time to do this with me. Every hard moment that I've had in my life, you have always been there to rally around. I remember when we were teenagers and we used to sneak into the Lion Country Safari where they had the Irvine
You always said we
Amphitheater.
ran through the hippopotamus
No, the rhino pit. I think we used to run
get
through.
into the concert venue.
That's right. I think that's what we did. But you taught me a lot, and you were a great role model for me.
Thank you. I'm so inspired by you and all the things that you do. You're really amazing. So, guess we'll wrap it here. I am so excited for you this summer. If you're booking speaking gigs and getting to go on to other stages, because you'll continue to grow as a presenter and a leader. And you've got the podcast, Making Maverick Moves. Look for that wherever you get your podcasts. Gina's inspiring you and talking to some other leaders who've made their Maverick moves. So,
Thank you,
great.
sister.
Thank you. Love you.
Love you.
Making Maverick Moves with Gina L Osborn is produced and edited by Zill Media. Connect with us on social media at GinaLOsborn.com/Making Maverick Moves. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe to Making Maverick Moves wherever you get your podcasts.